is Bikram Sandhu.
My name is Ashton White.
I'm Charlize Clark.
I'm Rashard Kreitz, and our presentation is on the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Events that led up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, beginning with post-World War II. During World War II, the U.S. and Soviets worked together as allies, yet the U.S. had never agreed with how the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviets and their practice of communism. President Truman was an anti-communist and wanted little to do with the Soviets when he stepped into office in 1945. The Soviets had their own issues with the U.S. as well. Many Soviets had been upset over the Americans' decades-long refusal to treat the Soviet Union as legitimately part of the international community. The Soviets were also upset over the U.S.'s late entry to World War II. This resulted in the death of about 26 million Soviet citizens, while only about 405,000 U.S. deaths. This resulted in a mutual distrust between the two countries following World War II. Because of the looming Soviet threat, most American government officials agreed upon using containment as the best strategy to combat the threat of the Soviet Union in 1947. The diplomat George Kennan explained the strategy of containment in his famous long telegram. He stated that the Soviet Union was a quote-unquote a political force committed fanatically to a belief that with the U.S. there can be no permanent modus vivendi. He further stated that the Americans' decision was the long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. This telegram was declared before Congress in 1947. This also shaped the American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The containment strategy began to lead the U.S. to an arms buildup when American officials encouraged the development of nuclear weapons, thus beginning the arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested their own atomic bomb, which caused President Truman to announce that the U.S. would build a more destructive weapon called the super bomb, or a hydrogen bomb. The war continued to develop as the war extended to space. Soviets launched their first man-made satellite in space in 1957, called Sputnik. The U.S. quickly followed by launching their own satellite, called the Explorer 1, in 1958. The Soviets eventually won the race by sending the first man in space in April of 1961. Now, the relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro begins to align himself with the Soviet leader after seizing power of Cuba in 1959. Cuba then grew dependent on the Soviet Union for economic and military aid. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev wanted to send missiles to Cuba with a goal of increasing his nation's nuclear strike capability. Another reason was because the very hostile relationship between the U.S. and Cuba at the time. In 1961, the Kennedy administration had launched an attack on Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion and failed in an attempt to assassinate Castro. The U.S. also demanded the Soviets to stop construction in a newly discovered missile base in communist China in the fall of 1962.
Alright, so on October 14th, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane spots missile construction in the Cuban countryside. Remember, the U.S. is adversely opposed to the Cuban government because of some history with anti-communist rhetoric, as well as the Bay of Pigs that occurred in 1961. The very next day, a group of several CIA analysts spotted a transport of nuclear weaponry across the Cuban countryside. And the next day, on October 16th, Kennedy and his administration formed XCOM to discuss the proceedings of the crisis.
I didn't even have it in present mode. I am my bad, bro.
Okay. On October 14th, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane spotted missile construction in the Cuban countryside. Remember that the U.S. is adversely opposed to the Cuban government because of some anti-communist rhetoric within the U.S. government in previous administrations, and the Pigs event in 1961 that occurred the previous year. The next day, a group of CIA analysts spotted a transport of nuclear weaponry across the countryside. And so this only increased the tension and made things seem more scarce. The very next day, on the 16th, Kennedy and his administration formed ExComm to discuss the proceedings of the crisis. So the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, provided Kennedy with 3 options. So the options were immediate diplomacy with the Soviet Union and Cuba, which would immediately de-escalate all conflict and create peace between the 3 nations. This was a very an unlikely approach, and thus Kennedy was unlikely to choose it. The second option was the naval quarantine of Cuba, which would prevent all naval travel in and around the proximity of Cuba for purposes of directing the focus between the US and the Soviet Union to negotiate a deal and to give them time to negotiate a deal with what should be done with Cuba. The third option was an airstrike on the Cuban countryside, which would be an extremely offensive choice and would likely trigger a counterattack, possibly on Berlin by Russian forces, and this just ultimately wasn't a really rational choice. So Kennedy decided to quarantine Cuba. In reality, it was a blockade that prevented all naval travel through Cuba, but he called it a quarantine because he didn't want to bring up any war terminology in his public address, and he didn't want to make Cuba believe that they were in the midst of an impending war. So on October 18th, Kennedy announces the plan to the public to prevent weapon transports to Cuba and demands the Soviet Union to withdraw the missiles from Cuban soil. On October 22nd, JFK writes to the Russian leader at the time, Nikita Khrushchev, in hopes to prevent nuclear catastrophe. He says the following: "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would, in this nuclear age, deliberately plunge the world into war which is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor." Back and forth deliberation continues to ensue between the leaders of the 2 nations. The next day, Khrushchev responds to JFK and insists that the missiles in Cuba are strictly for defensive purposes and not for offensive purposes in any way. Regardless, Kennedy continues to demand the removal of the weapons from the Cuban countryside.
So the effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So one of the main reasons why it started was because of the US's missiles in Turkey. So after that, both countries agreed to remove their missiles. So the US got rid of theirs in Turkey, and the Soviets got rid of theirs in Cuba, as well as the fact that Fidel Castro felt kind of betrayed by the Russians in a way, because he felt as if he left them out to dry during the Cuban Revolution. And it also strengthened Kennedy's image in a national and a global scale, because it made it seem as though like they prevailed and they had won. And after that, they created a direct line from the White House to the Kremlin. So whenever either country needed to communicate, or whenever they had anything to talk about, there was always a way for them to talk, because before that there really wasn't a way. And then also another thing was that both countries realized that they didn't want to go to war with one another, since they were so powerful, and they knew that the missiles and all the nukes that they had. And for the detente period, so it was easing tensions between the Soviets and the US, and it lasted from 1967 to 1979. And what it was that it increased trade and cooperation between the 2 countries, and they also signed the SALT Act, which meant that each nation could only have a certain amount of nukes. And they also created a 5-year freeze of testing deployment of ICBMs. And also after this, the U.S. would send the USSR wheat as a way of trading. That's what
Okay. I have the art. This is my first one. I don't know if you can see the fear at the bottom, but this is just supposed to show the fear that encompassed not only the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the what is it called? the Cold War as a whole, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War as a whole, going along with the Red Scare, but also the Cuban Missile Crisis, it happened because both Russia and the U.S. were both scared. Both were in fear. I don't know. We're both scared because the U.S. had bombs in Italy and Turkey, and the USSR used those as reasons why they put their bombs in Cuba as a safety precaution from the U.S. And the reason the U.S. had those in Turkey was a safety precaution because of the USSR. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the U.S. and the world have ever been to breaking out into full nuclear war. And both sides knew and were scared of mutually assured destruction, which is part of why it didn't happen. Fear taking place on both sides again. And our second piece of art that I did also is supposed to showcase the battle of ideologies. I'll send pictures of this to you. Battle of ideologies between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So communism versus capitalism, I guess.